Something fundamental has shifted in Washington, and most Americans are still looking at it through an old lens. This is not a rerun of 2017. This is not chaos. This is construction. And if you don't understand the structure being built right now, you won't understand the country you're living in 6 months from now. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today we break down what's shaping our world. If you value serious, independent analysis that connects policy to your wallet, your security, and your future, subscribe to the channel. Support matters. It allows us to keep doing this work without noise, without spin, and without fear. Let's get into it. Donald Trump's second term is not about disruption, it is about expansion. In his first presidency, Trump tested the boundaries of executive authority. He challenged institutions, confronted media, renegotiated trade agreements, and reshaped immigration enforcement. But that phase was reactive. It was about pushing against resistance. This second term feels different. It is proactive, coordinated, strategic. Look at the pattern. A precision operation to capture Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. A multi-layered strike campaign inside Iran under Operation Epic Fury. Renewed pressure over Greenland and the Arctic. A push to integrate artificial intelligence directly into defense infrastructure. Wecker aggressive tariff leverage used not just as trade policy, but as geopolitical signaling. This is not random activity. It is a multi-domain expansion of American power centered in the executive branch. There are 5 pillars emerging. First, military projection beyond deterrence. The strikes in Tehran were not symbolic. They were decapitation-style operations. That signals a willingness to move from containment to coercive restructuring of adversarial regimes. Second, economic leverage through energy and trade. Oil markets react to every escalation in the Strait of Hormuz. Tariffs are used as both economic tools and diplomatic pressure points. Energy pricing now intersects directly with national security strategy. Third, technological acceleration. The confrontation between Anthropic and the Pentagon exposed something deeper. Artificial intelligence is no longer a private sector experiment. It is becoming state infrastructure. When companies like OpenAI and XCI integrate into classified networks, we are witnessing the formation of a new military tech complex. Fourth, narrative influence. The massive consolidation battles in media, including the Paramount bid for Warner Bros., matter because information is power. Control of narrative shapes public tolerance for expansion. Fifth, territorial positioning. Greenland is not just a headline. It sits at the intersection of Arctic sea lanes, rare earth minerals, and missile defense architecture. Strategic geography is back at the center of American calculation. Now here is the crucial question. Can expansion outpace constraint? Power is not just projection, it is sustainability. The United States carries massive fiscal deficits. Inflation remains politically sensitive. Military stockpiles are finite. Approval ratings hover below majority levels. Courts remain active. Institutions resist. And history teaches us that second terms are when presidents attempt legacy moves. But legacy moves require structural backing. Reagan consolidated power because economic growth supported it. George W. Bush expanded power, but faced backlash when war and deficits converge. Expansion without economic alignment creates strain, and strain eventually surfaces in the one place that decides everything in America, the middle-class household budget. If energy spikes, if inflation returns, if conflict drags, political capital erodes. Trump's second term is a test, not just of strength, but of balance. Can he expand American leverage globally while preserving domestic stability? Can executive authority stretch without snapping institutional elasticity? Can strategic ambition remain anchored in economic resilience? That is the architecture question, because what we are watching is not chaos, it is design. And design in politics always carries consequences. War as leverage, Iran and the strategy of decapitation war is never just about the battlefield. It is about leverage. When the United States launched Operation Epic Fury inside Iran, this was not a symbolic strike designed for headlines. It was a structural signal. Decapitation targeting, hitting command nodes, senior leadership circles, strategic infrastructure, sends a message that goes beyond destruction. It says, we can reach you anywhere, anytime, and faster than you can reorganize. But that changes calculations. For decades, American strategy toward Iran oscillated between containment and negotiation. Sanctions, limited strikes, diplomatic frameworks. Even at moments of escalation, the logic was deterrence. Operation Epic Fury marked something different. It introduced coercive leverage, not simply to punish, but to destabilize command continuity. From a power perspective, that is a significant shift. Decapitation strategies aim to fracture decision-making, remove leadership, force internal chaos, collapse coordination. In theory, it shortens conflict by compressing the adversary's ability to respond. But theory and reality rarely align perfectly. Iran still possesses an estimated arsenal of roughly 2,000 short-range ballistic missiles, along with substantial one-way drone capabilities. Those weapons are not symbolic. They are math. And war is math. Every missile launch forces a response. The United States relies heavily on THAAD and Patriot interceptor systems. Interceptors are expensive. They are finite. And they are not manufactured overnight. A prolonged exchange transforms strategy into logistics. This is where leverage meets limitation. Iran's response has not been reckless saturation. It has been measured, staggered, calibrated. That signals preservation of deterrence capacity. A regime that feels existentially threatened might unleash everything at once. The fact that Tehran has not done so suggests a calculation: survive, absorb, endure. History offers sobering context. Air power alone rarely produces regime change. Operation Desert Storm required 6 weeks of sustained aerial assault before ground forces moved in. NATO's campaign in Yugoslavia lasted 78 days. Libya's air operations stretched more than 200 days. Leadership disruption does not automatically equal systemic collapse. If regime change is an objective, even implicitly, then the question becomes whether the United States is willing to escalate beyond air dominance. And that is where domestic politics re-enters the equation. Donald Trump's political base includes a strong isolationist strain. Vice President J.D. Vance has long expressed skepticism toward prolonged overseas entanglements. Military expansion generates initial unity. Sustained war generates scrutiny. Financially, the equation tightens further. The United States operates under heavy structural deficits. Extended conflict increases operational expenditures, depletes munitions stockpiles, and pressures defense manufacturing timelines. War spending can stimulate sectors, but it also compounds long-term debt servicing obligations. There is also an external risk: escalation spirals. Iran can widen conflict through proxy channels, energy choke points, or cyber retaliation. The Strait of Hormuz remains a global vulnerability. Regional allies face exposure. Each additional front complicates exit strategy. Leverage works best when it is decisive and brief. The longer it extends, the more variables enter the system. Strategically, Operation Epic Fury demonstrated reach. It demonstrated capability. It demonstrated intelligence integration at high precision. But reach is not resolution. The fundamental question now is endurance. Can the United States apply enough pressure to alter Tehran's behavior without triggering broader instability? Can Iran sustain retaliation without exhausting its own deterrent shield? And can Washington maintain domestic cohesion if the conflict stretches beyond the rapid phase initially suggested? War, in the end, is not only about destroying targets, it is about managing time, and time is the one resource that neither side can replenish. The energy shock doctrine. Energy is the pressure valve of geopolitics. You can win a military exchange and still lose the economic war if oil turns against you. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a narrow stretch of water on a map. It is the artery through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply flows. When tension rises there, markets do not wait for confirmation. They price risk instantly. Futures move. Shipping insurers adjust premiums. Traders hedge. And within days, now gasoline prices in Ohio and grocery costs in Arizona begin to feel the tremor. This is the energy shock doctrine. If Brent crude climbs toward $100 a barrel, inflation math shifts fast. Historically, every 5% increase in oil adds roughly 0.1 percentage points to inflation in advanced economies. That may sound small. It is not. At $100 oil, we could see zero point 0.6 to zero point 0.7 percentage points added to global inflation. That feeds directly into freight costs. Diesel powers trucks. Trucks move food. Fertilizer prices rise. Airlines increase ticket prices. Utility bills follow natural gas benchmarks. The supply chain transmits energy shock into every household budget. And here is where strategic power meets political reality. The Federal Reserve cannot cut interest rates aggressively if inflation accelerates. Higher oil means higher headline CPI. Even if core inflation remains steady, public perception anchors to what people see at the pump. Monetary policy tightens or stays restrictive. Mortgage rates remain elevated. Business borrowing costs stay high. Inflation is not an abstract macroeconomic statistic. It is psychological. It erodes confidence. It shapes voter sentiment faster than unemployment data ever will. Historically, energy shocks have destabilized presidencies. The 1973 oil embargo reshaped American politics. The late 1970s stagflation period destroyed trust in economic management. Even modest fuel spikes can swing midterm outcomes. Now layer in global dynamics. Iran produces roughly 4% of the world's oil. If its exports are disrupted, directly or indirectly, China must find replacement supply. That tightens global markets. Add in uncertainty around Gulf producers like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, and volatility multiplies. Even if Hormuz never fully closes, the perception of risk alone drives price spikes. This is why energy is leverage. For Washington, each sustained oil pressure can weaken adversaries whose economies depend on hydrocarbon exports, but it also imposes domestic cost. American consumers do not differentiate between strategic leverage and grocery bills. They feel pain, and pain translates into political pressure. Energy leverage works best when the domestic economy is strong enough to absorb volatility. If growth is steady, wages are rising, and supply chains are stable, oil spikes can be weathered. If households are already strained, the same spike becomes destabilizing. There is also the fiscal layer. Higher oil increases government transportation and procurement costs. Defense logistics become more expensive. Inflation-indexed debt payments rise. Deficits widen. Energy is both weapon and vulnerability. The strategic calculation facing Donald Trump is this: can geopolitical assertiveness coexist with price stability? Can power projection in the Middle East avoid igniting a domestic inflation backlash that undermines the very authority it seeks to project? Energy markets do not care about ideology. They care about supply, demand, and risk is rising. The energy shock doctrine reminds us that in modern geopolitics, the battlefield is not only overseas, it is the American household balance sheet. If oil climbs and stays high, expansion abroad collides with pressure at home. And no presidency escapes that collision. AI, the Pentagon, and the new industrial complex artificial intelligence is no longer a Silicon Valley experiment. It is a national power asset. The confrontation between Anthropic and the Pentagon was not a niche dispute about software policy. It was a preview of the next industrial realignment. When the Department of Defense demanded access to AI systems for all lawful use, and Anthropic refused to remove red lines around autonomous lethal weapons and mass surveillance, we saw something deeper than corporate disagreement. We saw a collision between private ethics and state power. And when Donald Trump responded with blacklisting threats in the language of compliance, the signal was unmistakable. AI is now strategic infrastructure. In the 20th century, President Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex. Defense contractors, weapons manufacturers, research labs, all intertwined with federal spending. That structure shaped American dominance for decades. What we are witnessing now is its evolution into a military tech complex. The stakes are even higher. Artificial intelligence compresses decision cycles. It analyzes battlefield data in seconds. It optimizes drone coordination. It predicts missile trajectories. It identifies cyber threats before human analysts can detect patterns. Whoever controls AI systems controls tempo. And in modern warfare, tempo determines victory. OpenAI reached an agreement with the Pentagon that reportedly included guardrails against autonomous weaponry and domestic mass surveillance. Elon Musk's XAI integrated Grok into classified networks. Anthropic resisted and faced political backlash. This divergence reveals a new power equation. Cooperation grants access and influence. Resistance risks marginalization. From a structural standpoint, the incentives are enormous. Defense contracts are stable. Government partnerships offer scale. Venture capital sees opportunity in national security integration. AI firms that align early may become foundational suppliers to the federal government, but the risks are equally profound. When the state pressures private firms to adjust ethical boundaries, the line between innovation and coercion blurs. If compliance becomes tied to political loyalty, technological development may drift from open competition towards centralized alignment. Historically, technological revolutions accelerate during conflict. The Manhattan Project centralized atomic research under federal authority. The Cold War fueled semiconductor innovation through defense spending. DARPA incubated technologies that later transformed civilian markets. AI could follow the same arc, but faster and more opaque. There is also the global dimension. China has made clear its ambition to dominate artificial intelligence for military and economic supremacy. If Washington hesitates, Beijing accelerates. That competitive pressure narrows space for ethical deliberation. The strategic calculation inside the White House likely looks simple. AI dominance equals strategic advantage. Delay equals vulnerability. But centralization carries cost. Innovation thrives in open ecosystems. Over-politicization can deter talent. If engineers fear legal consequences for ethical boundaries, some will leave. Others will relocate internationally. Talent mobility is a real variable in this equation. And then there is the constitutional layer. The expansion of executive influence into technological governance shifts power balance. Congress lags behind in technical literacy. Courts struggle with emerging frameworks. The executive branch moves fastest. This is not just about software. It is about sovereignty. In the coming years, wars may not be decided by troop counts, but by algorithmic precision. Supply chains will be optimized by AI. Cyber conflicts will be fought invisibly. Intelligence will be processed at machine speed. The question is not whether the military tech complex is forming. It is whether its growth will reinforce democratic accountability or quietly centralize unprecedented authority. Technology does not remain neutral once it integrates with power. It becomes power. The financialization of war. Prediction markets. For most of modern history, war moved markets. Now markets move with war in real time. Prediction platforms like Polymarket and Kalshi have turned geopolitical events into tradable contracts. Not just elections, not just economic indicators. Military strikes, regime collapse, ceasefire probabilities, the capture of Nicolas Maduro, U.S. action against Iran, all of it reduced to a price. That is not a minor shift. That is the financialization of conflict. In early 2026, suspiciously timed trades surfaced around U.S. military actions. Wallets reportedly funded within 24 hours placed yes bets hours before strikes were publicly confirmed. Some accounts walked away with six-figure gains. Combined volume across major platforms exceeded $30 billion in 2025. Here's the structural issue. When war becomes tradable, information becomes currency. Efficient market theory argues that prices reflect all available information. In a healthy market, that process aggregates dispersed knowledge and produces accurate forecasts. But that assumes information is broadly accessible. It assumes no insider advantage. Military operations do not operate under that assumption. If individuals with proximity to classified information can monetize that proximity through anonymous crypto wallets, the boundary between national security and private gain erodes. Even the perception of that possibility corrodes trust. Trust is the oxygen of both markets and democracy. From a power perspective, prediction markets compress reaction time. When odds on a strike move from 40% to 80% overnight, traders, analysts, and even foreign governments notice. Markets can telegraph escalation before press briefings do. That creates feedback loops. Governments monitor markets. Markets monitor governments. Now layer in political optics. Donald Trump Jr. Has advisory ties to prediction platforms. Lawmakers have called for crackdowns, arguing that war profits undermine public confidence. Regulators face a dilemma: clamp down too aggressively, and they risk stifling financial innovation. Move too slowly, and they risk legitimizing insider arbitrage on matters of life and death. There is also the behavioral dimension. When individuals can profit from geopolitical instability, incentives subtly shift. Traders root for volatility. An escalation becomes opportunity. The moral distance between observer and participant narrows. Conflict turns into yield. Financial markets are powerful because they allocate capital. But when they allocate capital towards speculation on violence, the system drifts into ethically unstable territory. At scale, this has systemic implications. Institutional investors may begin hedging geopolitical risk through prediction contracts, and hedge funds may treat regime change probabilities as portfolio variables. Insurance pricing may adjust dynamically based on market sentiment. In other words, war becomes embedded in financial architecture. The danger is not that prediction markets exist. Information aggregation has value. The danger is asymmetry and opacity. Crypto anonymity complicates enforcement. Cross-border participation muddies jurisdiction, and speed outpaces regulation. Historically, markets have always responded to war. But this is different. This is preemptive monetization. If left unchecked, the financialization of war risks creating a perception that insiders always win, that public sacrifice becomes private profit. And once that perception takes hold, legitimacy fractures. In an era where trust is already fragile, monetizing military action may prove more destabilizing than the action itself. Markets can price risk, but they cannot price credibility. And credibility, once lost, is far harder to rebuild than any stockpile. Media power and narrative control power is not only exercised through missiles, tariffs, or algorithms. It is exercised through narrative. Who frames events? Who defines crisis? Who decides whether an operation is defensive, preemptive, or reckless? In modern America, media architecture shapes political durability as much as battlefield outcomes. The $111 billion bid by Paramount for Warner Bros. Was not just a corporate merger. It was a consolidation of narrative infrastructure. Larry Ellison's expanding influence across media platforms signals something strategic. Control of distribution channels matters more than ever when geopolitical escalation and domestic polarization intersect. Information velocity has collapsed the gap between event and interpretation. Within minutes of a strike or policy announcement, cable networks, digital outlets, and social feeds construct meaning. That meaning shapes investor reaction, voter sentiment, and international perception. In the 20th century, media fragmentation limited centralized influence. Today, consolidation can amplify alignment. If Paramount controls assets connected to CNN and CBS, narrative tone can subtly shift across platforms, not through overt censorship, but through framing priorities, editorial emphasis, guest selection, and repetition. Framing is power. Consider this. During conflict escalation, the difference between strategic precision and reckless adventurism influences public tolerance. Economic volatility framed as temporary turbulence feels different than volatility framed as policy miscalculation. Language shapes stability. From a financial perspective, media consolidation is also about survivability. Traditional television faces declining ad revenue and cord cutting. Streaming competition compresses margins. Mergers promise scale efficiencies and cost cuts. But when political influence intersects with financial necessity, the incentive structure shifts. Owners seek stability. Stability often aligns with power centers. This is not conspiracy theory. It is structural logic. Media companies operate within regulatory environments shaped by federal agencies. Antitrust reviews, licensing approvals, and spectrum access all depend on government oversight. Alignment reduces friction. Historically, political leaders have understood the importance of media ecosystems. Franklin Roosevelt leveraged radio fireside chats to bypass hostile newspapers. John F. Kennedy mastered televised image. Ronald Reagan, a former actor, understood stagecraft. Donald Trump, arguably more than any modern president, understands amplification. But second-term consolidation introduces a new layer. It is not just about messaging, it is about institutional positioning. If major media entities consolidate under leadership sympathetic to executive priorities, narrative resistance narrows. Public skepticism may not disappear, but the megaphone shifts. There is also risk. Over-concentration of narrative control can erode credibility. Americans are deeply skeptical of centralized messaging. Trust in media institutions is already historically low. If consolidation appears politically driven, backlash can be swift. Moreover, when the alternative platforms thrive in distrust environments, independent creators, decentralized channels, and algorithm-driven networks bypass traditional gatekeepers. Power consolidation in legacy media may inadvertently accelerate fragmentation elsewhere. From a strategic standpoint, narrative control is about time. Leaders need public patience to execute policy. War, energy shocks, and technological realignments require narrative coherence to prevent panic. But narrative cannot permanently outrun reality. If inflation rises, if conflict drags, if economic stress spreads, messaging loses force. The credibility gap widens. The consolidation of media under figures like Larry Ellison reflects recognition that power today is hybrid. Military leverage, economic leverage, technological leverage, all require narrative scaffolding. Without narrative alignment, expansion falters. With too much narrative alignment, trust fractures. The balance between influence and credibility may determine whether consolidation strengthens authority or quietly undermines it. Greenland and the Arctic chessboard. Greenland is not a punchline, it is a pressure point. When Donald Trump revived the idea of bringing Greenland under U.S. control, critics laughed. They framed it as imperial nostalgia, as real estate bravado. But geopolitics is rarely about optics. It is about position. Pull up a map, not a distorted classroom projection, but a strategic one. Greenland sits between North America and Europe, beneath Arctic air routes, alongside emerging shipping lanes that climate change is slowly unlocking. Beneath its ice lie rare earth minerals critical for advanced weapon systems, semiconductors, and green energy infrastructure. At its northern edge stands Patuxent Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base, a cornerstone of U.S. missile defense and early warning systems since the Cold War. This is not symbolism. This is geometry. Born in the 21st century, geography is returning as a decisive factor in power competition. Russia has militarized its Arctic coastline. China calls itself a near-Arctic state and invests in polar routes and mineral access. Moscow and Beijing conduct joint exercises in the region. The Arctic is no longer frozen in irrelevance. It is thawing into strategic rivalry. Greenland is the hinge. Control or deep influence over Greenland would secure American access to Arctic sea lanes, it reinforced missile detection capabilities, and reduce dependence on China for rare earth supply chains. Roughly 37 of the 50 minerals the United States considers critical exist there in moderate to high quantities. In an era where semiconductor supply chains define economic resilience, mineral independence becomes national security. But acquisition is not simple. Greenland has self-rule under Denmark. Its population is small, roughly 57,000 people, but politically conscious. Prime Minister Mut Egede has made clear that Greenland is not for sale. Denmark's leadership has echoed that message. Any move perceived as coercive risks fracturing NATO cohesion at a time when alliance unity is already strained by broader geopolitical tensions. From a financial standpoint, the costs are immense. Estimates have suggested a price tag in the trillions if Greenland were ever hypothetically purchased. Beyond acquisition, when infrastructure investment would be required to unlock mineral resources and sustain development in one of the harshest climates on Earth. So why push the issue? Because in strategic planning, you think decades ahead. As ice recedes, Arctic shipping could reduce transit times between Asia and Europe. Whoever influences those corridors shapes global trade patterns. Missile defense architecture in the high north enhances deterrence posture against adversaries capable of polar trajectory launches. A resource independence shields American manufacturing from external leverage. Greenland is not about territory alone. It is about strategic insulation. There is also a signaling component. By openly discussing Greenland, Trump signals to Moscow and Beijing that the United States recognizes the Arctic as contested terrain. Silence implies complacency. Assertion implies engagement. But assertion must be balanced with diplomacy. Overreach could push European allies into the defensive posture, while tariff threats linked to Arctic disputes risk a dangerous downward spiral, as some NATO partners have warned. Strategic ambition without alliance management creates friction. The Arctic chessboard is complex. It blends climate change, military positioning, resource economics, and alliance politics into a single theater. Greenland represents leverage, but leverage only strengthens power if exercised with precision. In the coming decades, the Arctic may prove as consequential as the Middle East was in the 20th century, and positioning now determines influence later. The ice is melting. The competition is not. Immigration success versus institutional friction immigration is where rhetoric meets measurable reality. Unlike foreign policy, unlike media consolidation, unlike Arctic strategy, immigration produces visible data points. Border encounters rise or fall. Processing times expand or contract. Deportations increase or decline. The American public does not need complex models to understand it. They see numbers. They see headlines. They see communities changing. And in Donald Trump's second term, illegal crossings at the U.S.-Mexico border have fallen sharply, in some periods to record lows. That is not narrative. That is enforcement impact. The immediate cancellation of the CBP One app, which previously allowed migrants to schedule appointments with U.S. border officials, signaled a structural shift. Where administrative facilitation was replaced by deterrence. Border patrol capacity was reinforced. Interior enforcement messaging hardened. The signal to would-be entrants was clear. The permissive window has closed. Politically, this consolidates Trump's core base. Immigration has been central to his political identity since 2015. In second-term strategy, delivering visible results on a flagship issue strengthens executive credibility. It reinforces the perception of competence. It says, promises made, promises kept. But policy success at the border is only one layer. Immigration is also labor economics. The United States has faced persistent labor shortages in agriculture, construction, hospitality, and certain service sectors. Undocumented labor, while politically contentious, has historically filled structural gaps in low-wage industries. When inflows decline rapidly, labor supply tightens. Tighter labor markets can push wages higher at the lower end, when that benefits some American workers. But it can also increase costs for businesses operating on thin margins. Food prices, housing construction costs, service pricing. The inflation equation intersects with immigration policy. This is where institutional friction emerges. State governments vary widely in their enforcement posture. Sanctuary policies in certain cities create federal-state tension. Court challenges emerge when executive directives stretch the statutory interpretation. Federal judges evaluate due process claims. Immigration law is dense, layered, and heavily litigated. Executive action can move quickly. Legal process moves deliberately. Historically, immigration reform has required congressional alignment. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 under Ronald Reagan combined enforcement with legalization. Post-9/11 security reforms expanded federal authority, but durable change required legislation. Trump's second-term approach leans heavily on executive tools, administrative rule changes, agency directives, and enforcement prioritization. That is faster, but it is also more vulnerable to judicial reversal and political turnover. There is also the demographic dimension. The United States is aging. Birth rates are below replacement level. Long-term economic growth depends on workforce expansion and productivity gains. Immigration historically offsets demographic decline. Without sustained legal immigration pathways, labor force growth slows, placing pressure on entitlement systems like Social Security and Medicare. That is not ideology. That is actuarial math. If enforcement tightens without parallel legal immigration reform, long-term economic growth could face structural headwinds. Skilled immigration, in particular, drives innovation sectors. Technology, healthcare, research, these rely heavily on foreign-born talent. On the balancing border control with economic vitality is the policy challenge. Then there is the political psychology. Immigration touches identity, community cohesion, cultural continuity. It is not purely economic. When border crossings surged in previous years, public confidence in institutional control eroded. Perception of disorder fuels populism, restoring order restores trust. But enforcement without narrative integration risks polarization. In communities with high immigrant populations may feel targeted. Advocacy groups mobilize. Media narratives diverge sharply. Institutional actors, universities, nonprofit organizations, local governments push back against federal directives. Friction becomes layered. From a power structure perspective, immigration policy tests federal supremacy. The Constitution grants the federal government authority over naturalization and border control. But implementation intersects with state-level law enforcement and local governance. Cooperation is not automatic. The more aggressively the executive branch pushes, the more legal challenges multiply. We must also examine fiscal implications. Mass deportation operations are expensive. Detention facilities, transportation logistics, court backlogs, and administrative processing require funding. Congress must appropriate those funds. Finally, if budget battles intensify, especially amid broader fiscal strain, immigration enforcement becomes entangled with deficit politics. And deficits are already high. The strategic question is sustainability. Can strict enforcement remain politically and economically stable over multiple years? Will labor markets adjust smoothly? Will Congress eventually codify reforms? Or will executive action remain the primary vehicle? History suggests that immigration policy oscillates, enforcement surges, backlogs build, political coalitions shift. Eventually, comprehensive reform becomes unavoidable. Trump's second term has clearly demonstrated capacity to reduce unlawful crossings. That is measurable leverage. But institutional friction is not a temporary obstacle. It is built into the American system. The Supreme Court, federal district courts, state governors, mayors, congressional committees, advocacy groups, business lobbies, all exert pressure. In a polarized environment, online immigration becomes both achievement and flashpoint. From my perspective, the decisive factor will be whether enforcement success translates into broader legislative alignment. If Congress remains gridlocked, executive-driven policy may hold in the short term but lack permanence. If economic growth remains stable and labor shortages are mitigated through legal channels, enforcement gains durability. If economic strain rises and sectors struggle to adapt, pressure builds. Immigration is where executive power meets constitutional design, economic reality, and social identity all at once. It is not a simple victory lap. It is a structural test, and how that test unfolds will shape not just Trump's second term, but the long-term demographic and economic trajectory of the United States. Control is visible. Sustainability is harder. The coming years will determine which one defines the outcome. The limits of expansion. Expansion always feels strongest at its peak. History teaches us something uncomfortable. Power does not collapse because it is weak. It strains because it overextends. Donald Trump's second term has been defined by assertiveness, military leverage abroad, tighter enforcement at home, technological acceleration, tariff pressure, Arctic positioning. Each move projects strength. Each move signals intent. But power, in structural terms, is not defined by movement alone. It is defined by capacity. Capacity is economic, fiscal, political, and institutional. Start with the fiscal reality. The United States is running structural deficits exceeding $1 trillion annually. Interest payments on the national debt are rising sharply as higher rates persist. Every extended military operation increases operational expenditure. Every energy shock increases inflation risk. Every enforcement surge carries budgetary cost. Debt does not constrain immediately. It constrains gradually, then suddenly. If global investors begin demanding higher yields to finance American deficits, borrowing costs rise. Higher borrowing costs feed directly into mortgage rates, business investment, and federal interest payments. Expansion abroad becomes more expensive at home. Now layer in political capacity. Approval ratings remain below majority thresholds. Core support is solid, but expansion requires elasticity beyond the base. Military escalation, prolonged economic volatility, or visible institutional conflict can narrow coalition width. Second terms historically face diminishing political capital. Legislators calculate legacy positioning, allies hedge, opposition consolidates. Even Vice President J.D. Vance represents a reminder that the coalition includes isolationist instincts. If foreign engagement deepens, internal fractures could widen. Institutional capacity also matters. Executive orders move quickly, but courts review, states resist. Bureaucracies slow implementation. The American system was designed to diffuse authority. Expansion that pushes aggressively against that design triggers friction. Friction is not failure, but friction consumes time and energy. There is also the global constraint. China remains an economic superpower. Russia remains militarily assertive. Europe remains an essential ally, even amid tension. Power expansion in one theater requires bandwidth. Diplomatic capital is finite. Military resources are finite. Public attention is finite. Historian Paul Kennedy warned of imperial overstretch, when a great power's strategic commitments exceed its economic base. That does not mean collapse is imminent. It means imbalance creates vulnerability. The United States retains enormous structural advantages: reserve currency status, deep capital markets, technological innovation, demographic diversity. But those advantages must be aligned with strategy. Expansion without alignment creates drag. The ultimate limit is not foreign resistance, it is domestic resilience. If inflation accelerates, if growth slows, if markets destabilize, political tolerance narrows. Middle-class households are the true stabilizing force in American politics. When they feel secure, expansion is tolerated. When they feel strained, retrenchment follows. The question facing Donald Trump's second term is not whether expansion is possible. It clearly is. When the question is whether expansion is synchronized with sustainability. Can military leverage remain brief and decisive? Can energy volatility be absorbed without inflation backlash? Can technological centralization avoid talent flight? Can media consolidation maintain credibility? Can immigration enforcement coexist with economic vitality? Every presidency reaches a moment when ambition meets gravity. The limits of expansion are not theoretical. They are structural. Mana and structure always wins over momentum in the long run. The decisive question: durable power or peak leverage? Every presidency reaches a defining moment. Not a headline moment, not a viral moment, a structural moment. Donald Trump's second term is approaching that point now. The decisive question is not whether power has been projected. It has. Military operations have demonstrated reach. Immigration enforcement has shown measurable impact. Where artificial intelligence has moved from private lab to national security asset. Trade and energy policy have been wielded as strategic tools. Greenland has re-entered geopolitical conversation. Media consolidation has shifted narrative terrain. The question is simpler and harder. Is this durable power? Or is this peak leverage? Peak leverage is when momentum feels unstoppable, when adversaries hesitate, when supporters feel vindicated, when headlines reinforce strength. But leverage without reinforcement is temporary. It peaks, then it recedes. Durable power is different. Durable power rests on economic stability, institutional legitimacy, alliance cohesion, and public confidence. It survives volatility because it is rooted in structure. From a political economy standpoint, durability depends on three pillars. First, economic alignment. If inflation remains contained, if growth stabilizes, if employment holds steady, expansion becomes sustainable. Markets tolerate assertiveness when macro fundamentals are solid, but if energy shocks persist, if deficits widen under rising interest costs, if households feel squeezed, expansion loses oxygen. Second, institutional balance. Executive authority can move quickly, but long-term durability requires legislative backing and judicial resilience. Policies anchored in executive orders alone are vulnerable to reversal. Durable power requires statutory reinforcement. It requires bipartisan endurance, even if limited. Third, coalition breadth. Approval ratings do not need to soar above 60%, but they must avoid erosion below governing viability. A presidency cannot operate on base loyalty alone during prolonged strategic shifts. Political elasticity matters. Internationally, the test is equally sharp. Will adversaries recalibrate behavior in response to pressure, or will they adapt and harden? Will allies deepen cooperation or hedge against unpredictability? Sustainable influence strengthens alliances. Peak leverage sometimes strains them. History offers contrast. The United States emerged from World War II with durable power because economic growth, industrial dominance, and institutional consensus aligned. By contrast, post-2003 Iraq demonstrated peak leverage without durable stabilization. Military superiority was clear. Political and economic consolidation proved elusive. The difference was structure. So Trump's second term is operating at high velocity. Velocity can generate advantage. It can also mask fragility. The decisive question then is this: can expansion be converted into institutionalized strength? Can short-term advantage be transformed into long-term architecture? Durable power requires patience. It requires restraint in key moments. It requires economic stewardship as much as strategic boldness. Peak leverage feels dramatic. Durable power feels steady. In the months ahead, you watch inflation, watch bond yields, watch approval trends, watch alliance cohesion. Those indicators will reveal whether we are witnessing consolidation or climax. Because in geopolitics, momentum is visible, but sustainability is decisive. And sustainability is what ultimately defines legacy. What we've explored is more than a political chapter. It is a case study in how power expands, strains, and defines legacy. But Donald Trump's second term has been marked by acceleration, military pressure abroad, hardline immigration enforcement at home, aggressive positioning in energy, AI integration with the Pentagon, media consolidation, and renewed Arctic ambition around Greenland. Each move signals strength. Each move seeks leverage. But leverage is not the same as permanence. The true test is whether expansion converts into stability, whether bold action aligns with economic resilience, institutional balance, and public trust. The deeper lesson here applies beyond politics. In life, momentum feels powerful. Promotions, investments, rapid growth, they all create the illusion of invincibility. But without structure, discipline, financial prudence, emotional control, expansion becomes fragile. Sustainable success is built, not declared. It requires balance between ambition and foundation. Now, a quick question for you. Which defines real leadership? A, rapid expansion and bold action. B, steady growth and long-term stability. Comment A or B below. And what's your view? Is this durable strength or peak leverage? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your perspective. If you value deep, clear analysis like this, subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps this conversation going, and the next discussion will go even further.